A man's war shirt from the Crow Indians of what is now south central Montana. Beautiful, of course, ermine tails, this detailed beadwork, all which has meaning, represents something significant. But the whole concept of a war shirt, of course, represents for many of us a stereotype. Plains Indian warriors. It's often as if Indian warrior these are synonymous terms. But I think it's important to remember that people are not warlike necessarily by nature, but perhaps by circumstance. And I think that's borne out in the history of the Crow people and their reputation as a military society, which they have very much by the 19th century, is earned not because they fought tooth and nail against the United States, as did many of their neighbors, but because they fought tooth and nail against their neighbors. And in fact, spent much of the 19th century allied to the United States. So that when we look at the map of Indian America from colonial times right through to the 19th century, it's important to remember that in virtually every war fought between Indians and non-Indians, there are Indians on both sides. Not because they're racial traders, not because they're pawns of the colonizing power, but because they are separate individual nations and they have their own foreign policies and they have their own agendas. And in the case of the Crow, by the 19th century, their own strategies for survival. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where George Armstrong's Custer was defeated and his command destroyed by the allied Lakota and Cheyenne Indians, an army relief column heading toward the battlefield with Crow scouts saw Crow Indians coming towards it. These were the Crow scouts who'd been with Custer. And the two groups of Crow scouts met. Right? So the first news of Custer's destruction was conveyed by Crows to Crows. And when the Crows who were coming with the relief column heard that news, apparently, they dismounted and they wept. Well, if you know anything about George Armstrong Custer, you know they weren't weeping for Custer. Why they were weeping in this ritual fashion was because that battle was a tragedy for the Crow Indians. The Battle of the Little Bighorn, if you visit that battlefield today, it's on the Crow Agency. It happened on Crow country. And it was a fairly regular occurrence for the allied bands of the Lakota to hold their sundance and then essentially invade Crow territory. And what was going on there had been going on through much of the 19th century. The Crow people originated from the Hidatsas on the Missouri. Crow traditions tell of Crow people migrating onto the plains, sometimes long meandering journeys before they settle on what becomes their homeland in the Bighorn Yellowstone Basin. And when they come to that homeland, they have arrived in essentially a hunter's paradise. It's rich in game, rich in buffalo herds. The Crows also become famous horse traders, horse riders. They trade for horses with the Salish people toward the Rocky Mountains. And those two things, wealth in buffalo and wealth in horses, those are the keys to power and prosperity on the Great Plains, on the northern plains in the 18th, early 19th century. Unfortunately, of course, that also makes the people who possess them targets for other people. The Crows were never a populous nation. When Lewis and Clark went through, they estimated the Crows at having a population of about 4,000 people, which would mean 1,000 warriors tops. And they were surrounded by other peoples, many of whom were pushing onto the plains to take advantage of that horse-buffalo equation, who were covetous of their wealth. And so by the 19th century, the Crows are under siege, as it were, by Lakota, Cheyenne, Assiniboine, Blackfeet, powerful Blackfeet Confederacy to their north and west, sometimes at war with Shoshones, Arapahoes, etc., whom the Crows say, all of whom want to destroy us and take our territory. And American traders operating among the Crows by the middle of the 18th century say they're on the edge of extinction, they're going to be wiped out. And they weren't. Two reasons. One, of course, they allied with the United States as another new and emerging power on the northern plains. The Crows made common cause with the United States, fighting against the Lakota and their allies. But also because Crow society, and this would be, I think, how Crows would view things, never gave up on its traditions and the military component that made Crow men Crows, which entailed fighting not just with weapons and courage, but with the assistance of powerful spiritual forces, which could be invoked and acquired through religious observance, through ritual, through living a proper life. And that sense of war as being a kind of sacred path, I think, gets embedded in Crow culture in the form of military societies where men compete with each other for war honors, in the status accorded to people who are shirt wearers or staff bearers, or people who were what the Crows called crazy dogs wishing to die, who'd taken a pledge for a year, sort of never to retreat from the enemy. There is embedded, imbued in the Crow warrior culture, this sense that as Crow people said it was better to die in battle than to live to an old age. At the same time, of course, if you only have 1,000 warriors and you're surrounded by thousands of people who are waging war against you, you cannot afford too many people to die in battle. Right? And so Crow history is this interesting struggle for survival against almost insurmountable odds. And it's a terrific example of the complexity of these Indian wars, which do not line up one group of people who are Indian against another group of people who are white. Crows fought against the Sioux and allied with the United States. So did Arikara. So did Shoshone. So eventually in time did Cheyenne. So eventually in time did some Lakota. Right? Changing circumstances required changing responses. Native leaders had to be flexible. The Crow chief Plentycoo said, "We fought with the United States because we had no choice. It was the right thing to do. It was the smart thing to do." And that's a position that I've heard echoed by Joe Medicine Crow, who was the Crow tribal historian in the 20th and into the 21st century. And it's perhaps brought out by the fact that if we look at where the Crow reservation is today, even though it's hugely reduced from what the Crow homeland originally was, it's still in the center of that homeland in south central Montana. Other groups were not so fortunate. Other groups who fought against the United States were shipped to Oklahoma. That was a fate that the Crows hoped to avoid and managed to avoid. In a shirt like this, it's not just a symbol, if you like, a representation of Plains male military traditions, but also, I think, a reminder of people having to make difficult choices in difficult times, and that we can't ever just assume that because they're Indian they act one way or another. They acted the way they did because they were Crows, and they were in circumstances that were particular, perilous, but in many ways unique to the Crows. And so what they did is, I think, what human beings do. you make the choices that make sense to you in the time, and then see where those lead.